Vasily Kandinsky famously said, "There is no must in art because art is free." This screencast is going to explore whether this statement could be taken as a slogan for modernism. By using examples from literature and the arts, such as works from the artist Marcel Duchamp, Ulysses by James Joyce, and the Imagist Manifesto, I'll be discussing the arguments for and against Kandinsky's statement being used as a slogan for modernism. Kandinsky lived in the late 19th, early 20th century and was a Russian abstract painter and theorist. He taught in the Bauhaus and painted such works as the one presented in the video, Composition 8, along with Landscape with Two Poplars and Transverse Line. So, what are the arguments for Kandinsky's statement being used as a slogan for modernism? A representation of art being free can be seen in the work of Marcel Duchamp, who originally chose chess, a restrictive game of rules, over art, but found that no matter what he tried, he could not escape the art world. By looking at 3 pieces of his art, the idea that art is free is supported. The first, Fountain, is an upturned urinal with the words R. Mutt 1917 graffitied on the side. The second is the Mona Lisa with a moustache and the letters LHOOQ inscribed at the base. Pronounced in French, these letters read Elle a chaud au col, or she is hot in the arse. And finally, the bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even, also known as the large glass due to its shape. These 3 pieces of art all use common objects such as a painting, glass and a urinal, with small adjustments to present the freeness of art. Duchamp himself said, "I believe that the artist doesn't know what he does. I attach even more importance to the spectator than to the artist." In a way, Duchamp is trying to say that art is free because the actual piece of art is just a small part of the artwork. So art is like a series of concentric circles. The inner circle is the piece of art. The next one out is the reception the art received, and the outer circle is the interpretation. The increasing size of the circles shows that the actual artwork is so small, and the reception and interpretation of the artwork is entirely free. A novel that also incited many different interpretations is Ulysses by James Joyce. The novel has become one of the most famous texts associated with modernism due to its unique nature and the lack of narrative conventions. The novel ends with the lines, "Yes, and all the queer little streets and pink and blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens and the jessamine and geraniums and cactuses and the Gibraltar girls where I was flower of the mountain. Yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes, and then he asked me would I say yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arm around him, yes, and he drew him down to me so that he could feel my breasts, all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will." Here, Molly expresses her thoughts and feelings through a jumble of ideas, or what is more commonly known as a stream of consciousness. The freedom of this chapter and the lack of punctuation has drawn a lot of attention to this section of Ulysses by critics. In his book, Joyce's Effects on Language, Theory and History, Derek Attridge discusses the chapter, Penelope, through the idea of flow. He talks in depth about the other critics' use of words rivers, streams and liquids to describe Molly's thoughts. Attridge looks at the freedom of this chapter through Molly as a character. Molly says very little throughout the novel, and what she does say is short and to the point. However, this chapter contains some of the longest sentences in English literature, and shows how the narrative structure, having no musts and no restrictions, through punctuation, presents freedom to read and freedom to interpret. However, opposing this idea of freedom, Attridge draws attention to Stuart Gilbert's schema, published in most copies of Ulysses. The complex guide to this novel opposes the idea that art is free. The titles given to each of the sections, such as Nestor, Proteus, Calypso, Cyclops, Narcissa, give no enlightenment to what is in the chapter without prior knowledge of Greek mythology or Homer's Odyssey. In this way, the novel becomes quite elitist and inaccessible. Ulysses is presented as having no must in the way it is written, but not being free in the way it is read, and the difficulty that reading the novel incurs. A movement of modernism which also resists the idea that art is free is the Imagist movement. F.S. Flint, in his manifesto, lists 3 rules for the writing of poetry in an Imagist fashion. 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that did not contribute to the presentation. 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of a metronome. By listing rules, Flint is restricting the creative flow that should accompany writing poetry. Ezra Pound has a very similar view to Flint in his manifesto, A Few Don'ts by an Imagist. The word don't immediately implies restrictions, and in his section on language, the word don't is used 5 times. An example of Pound's work is his poem, In a Station of the Metro. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet, black bough. It is short and finite, containing only necessary words, and describing standing on the platform at a French metro station, looking into a crowd. The constrictions of the writing takes away the poem's freedom, but does open up the interpretation of the poem, as each person gets something different out of it. This is something that Duchamp, who I mentioned earlier, would agree with. The interpretation of the poem is greater than the actual poem itself. An essay by Patrick McGuinness also analyses Imagist poetry. He begins by talking about how Flint, T. Hume, and Pound were part of the school of images, going on to say how the movement had split and the disputes about its foundation and principles had begun, and later saying that this was a movement founded upon economy, formal freedom, and precision. By using the oxymoron formal freedom, the constriction of the economy of words, and the restraint as to the poem's ambiguity, McGuinness is essentially suggesting that the Imagist movement contained very little freedom in writing. In conclusion, there is no must in art because art is free, is a highly disputable quote, which can be argued for and against, particularly through the novel Ulysses. Ulysses is freely written, in part with no punctuation or meaningful plot. However, it is hard to access because of how difficult it is to read and its elite writing style. Therefore, the question is not, is this a good statement for modernism? But the question that needs to be answered is, what is more important, the art itself or the interpretation of that art?